What's going on, guys? H-Dub here, and we got some exciting news today. Finally, Shadowkin faction will be opening. If you have not already had a chance to check out the latest raid digest, we will be going over it briefly in the video. But more importantly, we're going to be just looking at the best champions that you can use in the Shadowkin faction to complete the faction. Now, before we get started, I want to give a huge shout out to my good friend Mortal Pro. He's been a huge supporter of the channel as well as my streams. He's also purchased some of the merchandise from the clothing line that me and my father have. So happy birthday, man. I appreciate you. Thank you for all the support that you have showed this past year since we've met. And yeah, man, hope you have a great one. Now, let's take a look at the digest first to see what is coming in the game, and then we will get into the champions. As you can see here, greetings from Polarium, Happy New Year, yada yada. So we have this Chaos Ore thing coming into the game, which is going to allow us to rework some stats and substats of various artifacts. Now, we know with the Feast and the new barrels that came out, there was a large point requirement in the tournaments and events to get those, so we can probably expect the same from Chaos Ore. Similarly to the core hammers, those are typically difficult to get for most players, and those players usually don't have a chance to get those hammers needed to craft certain items in the forge. So Chaos Ore, good idea. Reworking gear, I like the idea, but it's going to be, probably inaccessible for most of the player base unless they're going to be spending. I wish I was wrong. So Polarium, please prove me wrong and make this something that could potentially be accessible. While I think it is a good option, I would recommend not really reworking pieces that aren't weapons, helmets, or shields, depending on where you are in the game, because it's also going to rework the primary stat. And if you want to gamble reworking primary stats of gauntlets, chest plates, and boots, go right ahead, but I personally probably won't be doing it. Maybe helmets, weapons, and shields if I do get a Chaos Ore, but we'll see about that. I'd rather try my luck spending my silver the first time and just sell the piece and get the silver back, or what silver I can get back, and then farm some more with some energy. I think that would be more efficient. But the best news, Shadowkin Crypt will be opening, and we will be looking at champs that are going to be helpful for the Crypt. We'll also be getting some extra slots for the vault, which we all know we're going to have to pay for. Now, let's look at the champions in the Shadowkin faction. I've already gone through all of them, and I've made a short list of who I think is going to be the best. Now, all of the champions will be usable if you have the gear to make them work, even the people that are single target. But I made a list just so that we can have an idea of who we're going to be using going in once it opens. So at this time, I don't know how usable the uncommon champs are going to be. Their kits are kind of lackluster at the moment. Maybe we will get some more uncommon champs that will be as helpful as Satyr is for his faction, because he's really useful. So maybe we will get some uncommon champions who can be more useful to this faction. But at this time, I don't think Infiltrator and Conscript are going to be that useful. So starting with the rares, and this is in no particular order, I just made the list based on me clicking on the champs and reading the skills. Let's start with Odachi. Odachi has a block debuffs as well as a 30% increased defense on his A3, which will be on a 3-turn cooldown, which I think could be pretty helpful. Works similarly to how Seducer works. He also has an AoE, which places a shield on himself afterwards, which could be useful. AoE attack is always useful. And he has a chance to place a provoke on his A1, so I think that will also come in handy, getting that good CC in. Bloodmass, also going to be a useful champ. On the A1, some turn meter control. On the A2, he has a 50% chance of placing a 15% decreased speed for 2 turns. And this is going to be on a 3-turn cooldown. You can also book the chance up. I think turn meter control is amazing. And on the A3, he has 100% chance booked to place a stun on a 3-turn cooldown. While it is single target, there are other champions in this faction that also have single target stun. So pair it with Bloodmass, I think it could go in our favor. Next, we're going to go over Marauder, who I think is an amazing champion. On the A3, has a 50% chance of placing a provoke for 1 turn. I was unsure on if this was going to be an AoE skill or a single target. I haven't tested it, but I'd be interested to see when I do test it. He also is going to place a shield buff on himself for 20% of his max HP and a reflect damage on all allies. So very useful there. On the A2, another AoE with the small decrease attack, which can be useful. Obviously, we want the big decrease attack, but we'll take the small decrease attack. Every bit of sustain that we can get will matter, especially if we are using rares. He also has a 15% chance of placing a stun on his A1, and you can book that up to 30%. Vagabond is another rare that I think could be useful. Not the best, but could be useful. On the A3, fills the turn meter of all allies and places a 25% increase attack buff. This is on a 3-turn cooldown book. The A2 attacks one enemy, has a 50% chance of placing a block buff for 1 turn. Also fills the champion's turn meter by 15% and fills the turn meter of the ally with the highest turn meter by 15% as well. On the A1, attacks one enemy, has a 20% chance of placing a sleep for 1 turn. Not too excited about the sleep, but I do think the turn meter increase can help a lot. Moving to the epics, let's start off with Burngeary, who I think is going to be an MVP champ for a lot of people in this faction. On the A1, he has a 20% chance of placing a provoke debuff, and you can book that up to a 40% chance, which is pretty good. His A2 has an AoE stun, which can be booked up to 60%, which is going to be amazing. On the A3, places a 25% strengthen buff on all allies for 2 turns. Also places a shield buff for 2 turns on all allies with less than 50% HP. The shield buff is equal to 15% of the target's max HP. So coming in, giving us a bit more sustain. And he's also going to give us some heals with the passive, which is going to be amazing. A resist aura, also not bad. A lot of people in the early mid game don't tend to focus resist. So if you find yourself needing some resist, especially on the boss where resisting could be the chance between you taking a debuff or not, when it matters, it's helpful. It's helpful to say the least. Next, we'll go ahead and talk about Taragi, who is an amazing champion. If you already didn't know, a lot of people using him in Clan Boss. Very helpful. On the A1, has a 30% chance of placing the big decrease attack for 2 turns. Can be booked to 40%. Has an AoE provoke on the A2, which is also going to be amazing because that good CC matters a lot in Faction Wars. Even though Faction Wars has gotten a lot easier because it was nerfed around the time that Lydia got placed into the game, you still want as much control as you can get. On the A3, he's going to place a shield buff as well as an ally protection on all allies for 2 turns. Also going to heal himself by 25% of his max HP and place a 30% reflect damage, which is also going to be good, especially if he's got that provoke up already. His passive, when attacked, has a 50% chance of placing a 5% poison on an attacker, and this occurs once per hit. So he's also going to be doing some damage that way, getting some poisons up. There's a rare champion that also detonates poisons, so possibly could pair them with Taragi and make some way there. Next, we're going to talk about Oboro, who's getting a lot of use right now from players doing Hydra. But I also think she can be useful in Faction Wars. She's going to place a decreased defense on her A1, 50% chance booked, which is pretty good. And she'll attack all enemies instead if the target is under 4 or more debuffs. So if you have her with someone like Taragi, if they attack first, and they end up getting poisons on them. You have some other debuffers in there putting up fears or whatnot. There are a few champions that place fears in this faction as well. She will AoE with her A1, and that's great. A2 attacks one enemy 2 times. The second hit has a 75% chance of transferring all debuffs from this champion to the target. The first hit has a 75% chance of stealing all buffs from the target when attacking under Veil, Perfect Veil, which will be great, especially if we do get Valk waves in this faction. And our passive places a Revive on Death buff on herself for 3 turns whenever she receives a Veil. Next, we're going to talk about Jimbo, who a lot of people use in Arena. Great champion. Also think he's going to be awesome for the faction. His A1 attacks one enemy 2 times. Each hit steals any increased attack buffs. Each hit also has a 30% chance of stealing a random buff. The increased attack buff steal cannot be resisted. Attacks all enemies has an 80% chance of decreasing the duration of all buffs by 1 turn. This effect cannot be resisted on critical hits. Places a 30% increased crit rate buff and a 30% increased crit damage buff on himself for 3 turns, and then grants an extra turn. So he'll come in with the A2 right after that. Immune to decreased attack debuffs and will ignore unkillable and increase attack buff. Next, we're going to talk about Hotatsu, which I think could be decent here. Not going to be completely game changing, but I still think he'll be decent. He has a leech on the A1, which is going to be useful against the boss at any level. He has AoE on his A2 with decreased attack, the big decreased attack. We have a lot of decreased attack champs in this faction. Not many AoE decreased defenses though. Places a 60% increased defense buff on all allies for 2 turns, and places a 15% continuous heal. So we get some sustain, which I think can be useful. But ideally, you want to be going in with enough speed to kill all of the enemies on the waves. I think something like this would be more useful against the boss once you get to the boss. But ideally, on the waves, you want to be controlling the waves and let the waves take as little turns as possible. His passive is going to remove 1 debuff from the champion at the start of each turn. He'll remove stun, sleep, freeze, fear, true fear, provoke, petrification, debuffs before all other debuffs. Next, we're going to talk about Gorey. Gorey, who I think would be decent. Not another champ I don't think is going to be game breaking for this faction, but still decent for this faction because he's going to attack one enemy 2 times, place an extra hit if the target is under freeze. Heals this champion by 10% of the target of the damage inflicted. His A2 is going to attack 3 times at random. Each hit has a 75% chance of placing a freeze. You can book that to 100% chance. So I think this skill could actually be pretty useful because that's some more good CC. Even though it's random, it's a 100% chance to freeze. And anything that is a 100% chance, especially on 3-turn cooldown, is going to be very useful. The A3 attacks one enemy, will ignore increased defense and shield buffs, will also ignore 50% of the target's defense if they are under freeze debuffs. Now, freeze does reduce the damage that a target takes, so I think that this ignoring defense, 50% of ignoring defense is going to help him also do some more damage. We don't want to use too many attack-based champs, though, in any comp, unless we have, you know, a reviver for sure, which we don't really have a great reviver in this faction yet, or like one champion that just solely revives. You're also going to place a counterattack buff and a 50% increased attack buff on this champion for 2 turns if the attack kills an enemy. Counterattacks with the Cold Comfort skill whenever an enemy places any of these debuffs here on an ally. So if he does in fact hit pretty hard, I have not tested him myself, this would be a solid champ to run with as an attack-based champ in the faction. Next, we can talk about Umbratogi, who was in the last fusion, the Tutura fusion, one of the epics that we had to get, who I think has a solid kit. Another attack-based champ, so we just want to be careful of how many attack-based champs we're bringing in, especially if you are, you know, mid-game, around mid-game, trying to complete the faction. You're going to want sustain more. You want to stay alive because you can, as long as we don't have a health swap boss, which still isn't a problem if you have T6 War Master Mastery. But you do want to sustain. You're going to want as much damage as you can get, but you also want to stay alive. Probably got the words mixed up there a bit. Sorry, guys. Attacks one enemy 2 times. Has an additional 20% chance of inflicting a critical hit if this champion is under a Veil buff. The A2 attacks one enemy 2 times. Each hit will ignore 20% of the target's defense. Also has an additional 20% chance of inflicting a critical skill if this champion is under Veil. On the A3, she's going to place the Veil and increase speed on herself and fill her turn meter by 40% so she can come back around to her other skills. And the passive, whenever this champion is attacked, completely blocks 1 hit, decreasing the incoming damage to 0, then counterattacks with the default skill. So she's going to be counterattacking whenever she gets hit, which is awesome. An attack-based champion who can potentially sustain herself. I think she will be very valuable here. And she also has a crit rate aura, which can be very useful. And lastly, we'll talk about Massimoto, who I think will also be solid here. On the A1, attacks one enemy 2 times, has a 10% chance of stealing 1 random buff. On the A2, attacks all enemies, had a 50% chance of placing a 50% decrease attack. So we're seeing the AoE decrease attack again. Plays a 60% increased defense on the A3. And this is on all allies. Also going to fill the turn meters of all allies by 15%. And so we've seen so far a lot of turn meter increase and increased speed, decreased speed going on in this faction. And I think that is great. I know a lot of people were using Diabolus to cheese Demon Spawn simply because of the increased speed. Sorry, the increased speed, the increased turn meter, as well as the decreased turn meter. And so increasing the turn meter, very valuable in faction wars. Anywhere we can decrease turn meter as well, going to be very valuable, especially because we have Noel here, who is a legendary, and we're going to go over the legendaries now. Noel, he doesn't get a lot of love in the game. I have not seen him used much, but I do plan to use him in the faction for the simple fact of his passive. When an enemy's turn meter is fully depleted by any champion, has a 50% chance of placing True Fear on them for 1 turn, which is great. It can be booked also up to a 75% chance, and him paired with a lot of the other champions that are doing turn meter control is going to be solid. Also, Yoshi, who was a fusion, is also going to place True Fears, and that'll also help his kit. His A1 attacks one enemy, has a 40% chance of decreasing the duration of 2 random buffs on the target by 1 turn. If the target is under Fear or True Fear debuff, has a 65% chance of decreasing the duration of all targets buffs by 1 turn instead. So we're getting a lot of, stealing buffs, decreasing duration of buffs within this faction. That just leads me to believe that they're going to place us against Valk waves, but we will see when it comes out. On the A2, attacks one enemy will ignore 30% of the target's defense, fills this champion's turn meter by 25% after the attack. If the target is under a Fear or True Fear debuff, decrease the cooldown of the Dismay skill by 1 turn, which is this skill here. Attacks all enemies, has a 75% chance of decreasing each enemy's turn meter by 20%. If there are any enemies under Fear or True Fear debuffs, will also fill this champion's turn meter by the amount of those enemies lost. Will lose. Wait, did I read that right? Will also fill this champion's turn meters by the amount those enemies lose. Okay, gotcha. I thought that was grammatically incorrect. So we're seeing how True Fear and Fear work with his kit. So I think he's going to be solid with the faction, especially because we're going to have a lot of turn meter control. So his passive is going to kick in a lot. Next, we'll talk about Yoshi, who was a fusion and an awesome champion. Has a chance to place a stun on the A1. On the A2, he's going to do a random decreased accuracy and HP burn, which can be useful against bosses. Places a 50% increased attack and an increased accuracy buff on all allies for 2 turns. Also has a 50% chance of placing True Fear on all enemies for 1 turn. Has a 75% chance instead on enemies under increased attack buffs. and obviously that can be booked to 100%. His passive is going to fill his turn meter by 4% each time an enemy receives a buff. So maybe we're going to be seeing Valk waves. Sheesh. Next we'll talk about Ninja, who was a free login champion. Most people have him if they were playing around the time he was released. If you were not, I am sorry, because he is an amazing champion. A lot of people do hate on him when he first came out, but now everyone's using him in different places. Some people still neglect to use him because they're just anti-ninja. I think he's an amazing champion. On the A1, he's going to have a chance to place this decreased defense. Also going to fill his turn meter when used against bosses. The A2 attacks 3 times at random. Each hit has a 75% chance of placing an HP burn debuff for 3 turns. Also plays a perfect veil buff on this champion for 2 turns. When used against bosses, will instantly activate any HP burn debuffs, including HP burn debuffs placed by this skill. So he is amazing against the boss. When we get to the boss stages, Ninja is definitely going to be MVP for us. On the A3, he's going to do an AoE freeze, which can be booked to 100%. When targeting a boss, will only attack the boss and not all enemies, and will ignore 50% of the target's defense. Will also decrease the cooldown of his Hellburn skill by 1 turn, which we really want. It's already 3-turn cooldown booked. We want him to A2, then A3, and then come right back into the A2 if we can. Hopefully you have your ninja built fast enough to take another turn and come back really quick. A lot of people were using him in Relentless as well. I was using him in Relentless for a while. Mine is currently in a region set though. Next, we will talk about Ginzan, who is the only AoE decreased defense champ in the faction. I currently don't have one, but he's going to be very useful. He has attacks one enemy 3 times. Each hit fills this champion's turn meter by 6% on the A1. The A2, obviously the skill that we're all going to want, that AoE decreased defense. And he's also going to be increasing his turn meter by 10% on each critical hit. Attacks one enemy will ignore unkillable and shield buffs. Fills this champion by his turn meter by 30%. Fills this champion's turn meter by 60% instead if the target has a 50% HP or less after this attack. Also decreases the cooldown of Still Pairing and Faded Vengeance skills by 1 turn if this attack kills an enemy. So we see a lot of turn meter going on here. I love it. The passive increases his champion speed by 10 and resist by 50 if the number of champions on this champion's team is equal to or lower than the number of enemies on the opposing team. This effect always works when fighting bosses. So he's going to get a bit of a buff, which is awesome. Next, we'll talk about this new champion, Gamoran. He has a A1 where he can place block active skills, which is an amazing skill to use, especially if we do get those Valk waves or the Martyrs. I think they're on that same stage with them, with Black Knight. I want to say it's Martyr. The other 2 champs might be Lorias or something like that. And on that second wave is Warcasters, Valks, and I forget the Force champion that's right there. He never matters. The Valks matter more. But you're going to want to definitely be able to place that block active skills on them if you don't have a way to constantly keep controlling the turn meter, which we shouldn't have a problem with. We got a lot of people boosting turn meter in this faction. The A2 is an AoE, and he's going to steal a random buff from each enemy. After stealing, applies a buff spread effect, taking a random buff from this champion and placing it on all allies, which could be very helpful, especially if we are going against those Valk waves at the later stages and the that first wave as well. With the Martyrs, if they do take 2 turns, get their counterattack up. If the Valks take 1 turn, get their counterattack up. If Black Knight places unkillable, if Warcaster places block damage. So I really like his kit for there. Also on the A3, can target dead or living enemies. If the target is dead, plays a block revive on them, then attacks all enemies. Each enemy will receive damage equal to 20% of the target enemy's max HP. If the target is a boss's minion, the damage is equal to 20% of this champion's max HP. This attack cannot be critical and will ignore any shield buffs and 100% of the target's defense. If the target is alive, he's going to place a true fear on them for 2 turns and heal all allies by 20% of the target's max HP. If the target is a boss or boss's minion, the healing is equal to 20% of this champion's max HP. The true fear debuff cannot be resisted. Now, this is an essay to read and a lot to understand, but I think it can be very useful. Revives one random ally with 30% HP and 30% turn meter each time an enemy is killed. And this is on a 1-turn cooldown, which is why I plan on using him, because I don't have a reviver. Well, none of us really have a reviver in this faction. So he's going to be definitely useful. Next, we'll talk about Lady Kimmy, who a lot of people have. We've had several events where we've had opportunities to get her. Unfortunately, I did not get her, but she's currently used in a lot of arena teams at the moment, also Hydra teams, and she's an awesome champion. She's going to attack one enemy, then attacks the enemy with the highest turn meter on her A1, will attack the same enemy twice if the initial target also has the highest turn meter. The second hit has a 50% chance of decreasing the turn meter by 15%. The A2 is an AoE, decrease speed and decrease accuracy. Also has a 75% chance of decreasing each target's turn meter by 15%. So we're getting that turn meter control, which will proc the fears from Noel if they are fully depleted. So that's awesome. A3 removes one random buff from each enemy, then has a 75% chance of placing block buffs for 2 turns on enemies who have buffs removed. Also fills this champ's turn meter. Also fills the turn meter of all allies by 15% and places a 50% increased accuracy buff and a 30% increased speed buff on all allies for 2 turns. So we're getting more increased speed and increased accuracy, which can be very helpful, which means we can build champions with lower accuracy if we need. The passive, whenever this champion places a debuff on an enemy, also decreases the enemy's turn meter by 5% for each debuff placed. Whenever this champion or an ally receives a debuff, fills their turn meter by 5% for each debuff received. So she's an amazing champion, definitely going to be helpful in the faction. Kyoku is a newer champion and also going to be great here. Attacks one enemy, will place 3 hits if the target is under 3 or more debuffs. Each hit has a 40% chance of placing a 25% weaken for 2 turns. So we get some weaken on the A1. The A2 is an AoE, which has an 80% chance of placing a 50% decrease attack. So we got another AoE decrease attack champ. I think this is probably the 3rd or 4th one at least that we've read. After attacking, has an 80% chance of placing an HP burn debuff for 2 turns on all enemies that this skill did not place decrease attack on. So we definitely kind of want this HP burn more than a decrease attack, because we'll be getting damage, and we have other champs that can place decrease attack in the faction. Places a 50% ally protect on the A3 on all allies except this champion for 2 turns. Also places block damage on this champion for 3 turns and then grants an extra turn. Very useful skill. Only issue I have with it is she's going to take the extra turn and then lose the block damage. So kind of weird how this works, because we're going to get ally protection and then she's going to take another turn and then lose the block damage. So very weird. Every time this champion is hit with a critical hit, heals all allies by 15% of their max HP, then places 60% increased defense on all allies. So decent on the passive. That's on a 4-turn cooldown. Last but not least, we'll talk about Riho. Riho, another amazing champion, definitely going to be useful in the faction. Attacks one enemy, places a 15% continuous heal buff on the ally with the lowest HP for 1 turn. Also places 7.5% continuous heal buff on all allies with 30% HP or less for 1 turn. And that's on the A1. So we get plenty of heals off the A1. Places a stun debuff on a target enemy for 1 turn on the A2, as well as HP burn, 60% decreased defense, 25% weaken, and 50% decreased attack, 30% decreased crit rate as well, then attacks the target. The A3 removes all debuff from all allies, then places a block debuffs buff for 2 turns, also heals all allies by 35% of their max HP, and by a further 5% for each debuff removed from them. So this is an amazing skill, also on a 3-turn cooldown, so going to be great, and you can book the heals up a bit more. The passive, when receiving any debuffs, instantly transfers them from this champion to the attacker. Will not transfer debuffs that cannot be removed, obviously. So going to be a great champion. Now, Gentoro, he's great. He's a great champion. Definitely a strong legendary attack champion. I just don't think that he's going to be amazing for Faction Wars. Obviously, he's a Lego, so he's going to be good. He's going to be useful for sure. But I think some of the other champions just have a bit more to offer. I hope this video was helpful, guys. I hope you have some of these champions. Even if you don't have all of the legendaries, you can still make some headway with some of these rares and the epics. You can definitely pair some of these rares together and epics and be able to get the faction done. You just have to have the right gear and you have to have good RNG. But definitely a lot of comps can be made here. We have a lot of crowd control, a lot of turn meter control going on, plenty of attack champs, a lot of champs that can do damage. So hopefully this video was helpful for you. Hopefully you already got your Lydia and you're looking forward to Shadowkin. If you are not, you will have to complete Shadowkin before you can get Lydia, according to the latest raid digest. So best of luck with that. If you do need any assistance with Faction Wars, you can always message me on Discord and we can see what we can do to help you, depending on where you are in the game and what resources you have. We'll take a look at it and see what we can do. But until next time, guys, thank you for tuning in. Hope you have a blessed one. Be good and be well. I'm out.